The production of this video was made possible by donors to the Orchestration Online Patreon initiative. Please consider adding your support to the creation of free educational internet resources by visiting our Patreon page linked below. Hey there, this is your orchestration tutor Thomas Goss, bringing you the start of the 2023 Orchestration Challenge evaluation sessions. Though this video is being released today along with a Part 2 lecture covering the second movement, not to mention the evaluation guidelines, I actually scripted and recorded it over a month ago, before taking a look at any of this year's entries. It's only fair, before I start releasing videos of my evaluations of your scores, that we take a look at how I orchestrated the same material we all worked on. This year's piece, Beethoven's Piano Sonata number 24 in F sharp, Opus 78, is especially intense, with a lot of ground to cover, not to mention having two movements. But I'll try to be as brief as I can, and boil down each movement to a single lecture. I've already covered a lot of the issues facing today's orchestrators in dealing with the style and limitations of the early 19th century in my Pitfalls video. If you haven't watched it yet, why not? I hope you did before you entered this year's challenge. But all kidding aside, it will save me time going over the same issues, so watch that video to get the full context of this lecture. So let's start with an examination of the first piano score page, to assess the general challenges of setting this work from the beginning. As we see, the opening tempo is Adagio cantabile, which I indicated with a metronome marking of 40 beats per minute in the templates, though Spencer Myer's tempo in this year's official recording was more like around half that speed. It's perfectly okay if you followed his tempo instead of mine. I just felt that 40 was a better orchestral tempo, to keep the opening from sounding too glacial with winds, brass, and/or strings. The main concern I have here is whether the intro will set the mood for the rest of the movement, if not the entire sonata. So in some ways, these first 4 bars are perhaps the most critical in the challenge. Then the main theme starts, which I feel should follow the intro with a sense of inevitability, not to mention grace and elegance. There's a further concern as the melody continues, rising in octaves. Will it naturally transition to those octaves, or sound suddenly fuller, perhaps even blocky? As to the left-hand part, we're faced with some of the perennial questions of adapting figuration and patterns, so it's essential to establish a flowing accompaniment to the melody that supports it without sounding too energetic, and then expands without clogging up the sound picture. This leads naturally to the little flurries of motive in which the hands play off of one another. So will the orchestrator take advantage of this shift in approach by scoring a shift in texture? From the integrated, flowing opening statement to a more intimate, carefree exchange of contrasts in line and thematic texture? Then we have the added concern whether these bars require any harmonic support, as Beethoven sometimes supplied behind isolated lines such as these. Then, as this whole A section enters its closing phase, we have these crescendo triplets spilling downward, which implies a further contrast with those flurries we just examined, a more emphatic color of line. But that's just the start. There's also a degree of harmonic density that might need filling in, if this bar is to adequately set up those eloquent chords that finish this screen. And if we do add a more emphatic line and more harmonic density, should we maintain the strength and maintain the same texture, one bar leading to the next? Should we then contrast the next bar texturally and dynamically, and even go back and forth? Mind you, these criteria aren't always prescriptions of how to approach the material as an orchestrator. Sometimes they're just pondering over the natural problems and possible solutions that may arise. And I'm sure that I'll see many solutions that I hadn't considered at all, which is one of the most exciting aspects for me as your host for these challenges. Let's let Spencer Myer take over, and play through this page of score. As he does, think about all those problems that need solving, and judge for yourself whether you feel they address the material the right way, and if you confronted the same issues in your score. Now let's jump back to my score, which you heard at the beginning of the video. As you can see, I kept the orchestra simple. No piccolo or contrabassoon, just doubled winds with clarinets in B-flat. No percussion either, or any heavy brass. If Beethoven didn't need them most of the time, then neither do I, though I did add them in my orchestration of the second movement, so don't miss part 2 of this lecture. For this movement's brass, all I needed were 4 natural horns, 2 in F and 2 in C basso. Granted that there will be a few partially stopped and fully stopped pitches in each part, but I've kept these to a minimum, though admittedly scoring more horn in the texture than customary in Beethoven's own orchestration. Then, of course, the strings are scored just as Beethoven might, with a separate bass staff indicating a more independent role for that group of instruments. To set the mood, I chose a very simple approach: horns and chorale, with arco cellos and pizzicato basses in octaves. I felt that full arco octaves and both low string parts would be too heavy for the dignity of the horns above. So by scoring pizzicato basses, I not only lighten the load, but I also get a touch of the same punctuation of the piano's hammers on those octaves. Let's zoom in on those horns though, because here we can extend some of the lessons from the Pitfalls video. Notice that there are only a few stopped pitches here and there, mostly avoiding the first horn's melodic line. Though this is a chorale in 3-part harmony, I use all 4 horns, using some doubling of different lines and adding a note here or there. Some doublings from the C horn on open pitches help to bulk up the stopped and half-stopped pitches of the F horns, keeping the whole chorale more or less consistent in textural quality. That high B-flat is not too difficult a note on C basso horn, and certainly not for a standard modern valve horn on the same sounding pitch. What would follow such a passage inevitably in a Beethoven orchestral work? To my mind, a melodic statement on first violins, the true leading voice for his approach. Notice the very simple, natural divisions of bow from bar to bar, around which the whole string section can more or less conform. The portato bowing helps to form a nice relationship with the alternating pitches on second horn, my way of keeping a smooth flow through these bars while keeping the lower strings from getting too acrobatic on the figuration. Notice that the horn part needs no dynamic flex against the strings. The octave melody naturally evolves out of the string texture, with the basses keeping up the pizzicato on the low Fs. The little cadential trill helps focus the energy at the end of the phrase, as well as previewing the left-hand trills to come in later bars. That takes us to the little back and forth lines, which cry out to me to be scored on clarinet and bassoon. I wonder how many other orchestrators will have the same idea. All that's needed here is a little harmonic support from pianissimo strings to keep the feeling orchestral rather than chamber, though I could have left them out without making too much of a difference. Which leaves us with the wrap-up for this screen. Here I did fill in the harmony, middle strings teaming up with the horns. And I also decided to allow the crescendo to complete its arc with a mezzo forte in the next bar. The horns will just add weight and color without dominating, while their stopped pitches will be covered over in turn by the strings. Meanwhile, the first violins easily lead here on the triplet melody, with workable divisions of slurs for more natural bowing. The little double-stopped thirds that follow are simple enough to play non-divisi. But while I've allowed the phrase to fill out dynamically, I've also been thinking about the responding bars, casting them in a completely different section, at a kind of softer echo of a dynamic. I feel that reeds work best here, both in terms of balance and quality of color, and in contrast between bars of strings and winds. Notice that I've cleaned up the harmony, cutting some duplications of pitches that occur in the piano part, especially on those last full-fingered chords. One last thing to observe: how the different pairs of horns are suited to alternating roles of support or harmonized melody. though admittedly, that F third in the middle of the bar for C basso horn will be a little weak compared to its neighbors. Let's go back to the full screen now for a listen to this whole first section. This is the score I saw in my head the first time I heard Spencer Myer's performance in that YouTube video 11 years ago. On to the next section. Part B, running from bars 16 through 27, here in this next screen of the piano score. The first chord is really just a completion on the downbeat of the previous series of eloquent chords. So I will just be asking myself whether participants past this point treat it as such, or whether they treat it as a springboard into the next phrase. However it's done, the next thematic statement has to feel fresh and unique, preferably using some instrument or texture that hasn't made an appearance yet. As to the little left-hand intervals slowly creeping up, my instinct is that these should be stated simply, and with a timbre that's complementary to the melodic treatment. As they progress to descending chords, the orchestrator may want to think ahead a little, and prepare themselves for the eventual widening of the sound picture by the end of the passage. From bar 20, the accent should really bring out that alternating note in the middle of the chords, more than the outside notes. Back to that melody, where it breaks out into little 16th note patterns. There's probably no way that any single wind instrument could carry all those notes with precision all the way through to the next screen without a bit of interaction. I've addressed this issue in the Pitfalls video, a certain kind of dovetailing, trading off segments of patterns between two different instruments or string groups. But what's notable here as well is how the outside notes of each beam group naturally fall into a dotted rhythm pattern, which might be exploited to good effect. Similarly, the lower interior notes from bar 20 might also be played by an entirely different instrument or group of instruments. Perhaps the very last few bars of this screen might involve some kind of playing of the pattern all the way through without any trading off or dovetailing. But as I said in the Pitfalls video, really no more than 2 to 3 consecutive bars would be effective. And if so, then only after the musicians had all built up a certain momentum. But all these questions about the thematic material are only secondary to the real question of how to treat the overall texture as the accompanying chords descend even more and the hands get further and further apart. At first the separation is gradual, but then the leap downward to clustered pitches at the bottom of the bass staff may sound very clunky if orchestrated note for note. Some kind of gradual filling in and spreading out would be necessary in order to get a smooth, full-bodied dynamic peak by the end of the page. And this also applies to the last bar, in which Beethoven jumps the left hand up an octave in order to play the trilling G-sharp fifth. Direct transcription would leave a sudden hole in the bass at this point, so the horizontal texture may need a lot more consistency than Beethoven's two-handed scores suggests on its face. In my score, I treated the downbeat of bar 16 as a completion of the chordal idea, letting the winds have the final say, which I see as an effective setup for the next episode. The scoring here is a simple note-for-note transcription of the piano chords. As to the new melodic entrance, the best choice I see here is to give it to solo first flute. And now you may see the logic of withholding flutes in my orchestration up to this point. Beethoven's featured flute lines often have a folk-like, yet breathless quality to them, And this line is perfect for that kind of playing, starting in the rich middle register, pushing a little in ascending, and then falling into an easy dovetailing pattern with second flute. The little arpeggio at the end is easiest with just first flute, though, and helps set up the new approach on the downbeat to the next bar. Violins and violas keep the accompanying texture simple and unobtrusive. Yet true to my guidelines, I'm thinking ahead to the expansion of the material, adding cellos as the chords descend. From here, I'm thinking of that expansion more and more, using elements from within the source score to naturally increase the richness of the texture and the intensity of the dynamic. But just subtly at first, starting with the first violin spinning off from the first note of the flute solo and into these alternating Ds and Fs, letting the middle notes of the source score's right-hand patterns turn into their own element. Meanwhile, the first flute inhabits the suggestion of the dotted rhythms, joined by second flute dovetailing off the first note of each beam group with incisive staccatos that serve as a further bridge to the first violins. The left-hand chords maintain their transcription to middle strings, with just a tenuto stress on beats 1 and 3 in each bar instead of an accent. That articulation is saved for third horn, going back and forth between an accented, fully stopped G sharp, slurring to an open G natural. Notice that here I'm using stopped and open markings above the notes. I want no chance that the natural horn effect will be lost if the part is played on valve horn. But this isn't just the addition of a timbral hook. It's also an opportunity to expand the sound picture in anticipation of the full tutti at the end of the passage, which is achieved simply by doubling at the octave with first bassoon and double basses. Let's stay focused on that expansion, especially in the lower range of the orchestra. Bassoons double the lower strings, continuing the added octave on the lowest note of the left-hand piano chords, with pianissimo horns adding a little bit of warmth behind the chord across the middle strings. But as the music builds toward a forte dynamic over the following bar, those horns drop out, replaced by staccato chords on bassoons and second clarinet that spread the harmony downwards. By the time we get to the forte bar, all the elements are in place in strings and winds to naturally inhabit a fuller chord, not so clustered as with the source piano's left hand, but still with a lot of weight at the bottom. The addition of oboes on those repeated thirds helps to connect the fuller harmonic picture to the thematic elements above, which we'll discuss in a minute. In the fortissimo bar that follows, I keep the basses up, but still fill the hole that Beethoven left in the piano score, adding repeated horns to keep the momentum in the accompaniment strong while the second clarinet and second violins play that ferocious trill in the middle of the sound picture. If the horns and oboes stay forte instead of fortissimo, the balance should work fine. The only thing left to discuss is the action on top, looping patterns in the flutes and flurries in the first violins. Notice how the second flute changes from staccato to legato slurs as the music intensifies, just as the dotted rhythm in the first flute becomes fuller. By bar 25, I've scored the first violins as wildly going all in on the pattern, without any dovetailing, though I keep the flutes as they are. This really commits the energy going forward, pushing toward the resolution of the cadence at rehearsal C, and I did it by holding to my own rule of not having any instrument play a direct transcription of the pattern for more than 3 bars. Speaking of patterns, notice the bowing pattern on those last 3 bars, a very simple looping down bow on the slur to up bow on the final 16th. This actually adds some intensity to the up bow, as it will need a little extra speed to reposition between longer down bows. Let's hear all that again, without all my commentary. But see for yourself whether I got a smooth, natural increase of strength from the beginning to the end, and whether the colors and textures feel logically progressive. Rehearsal letter C takes us to the end of the first half of the sonata. It's a passage in which Beethoven wraps up his thematic ideas, seeming to modulate to the dominant of C-sharp major, but then ultimately moving back to the tonic for the repeat, or using that dominant as a hinge back to a tonic of F-sharp, but in the minor. For orchestrators, though, the passage is filled with delightful little opportunities of color, contrasts, and featured voices. That first chord functions the same as the beginning of rehearsal B, as we just saw, a concluding chord, so let's not worry about it too much. My instinct is to use Beethoven's dynamic markings as a guide to the scope of the orchestration. Cooler phrases will of course need lighter scoring, while flashes of temper suggest sudden intensification of texture and color. The question is whether we can avoid needless repetition of certain elements to keep the material fresh. Just like the opening melodic statement of the previous section, this first little phrase in triplets cries out for a different quality of tone than featured voices of the previous passage. Then when the phrase repeats, is there a way of contrasting the melodic instrument so as to not feel too repetitive? Could it be perhaps a choice of instruments that can naturally dominate the brash chords that follow? Or should that contrast as well? Then as the thematic material accelerates to 16th note runs, does the music demand a further contrast of melodic instrument? And will that choice also influence the character of the next set of chords? The span of instrumental registers covered by the descending phrase that follows suggests a kind of handing off from one to the other, if this is to be transcribed to winds, though first violins can handle the whole thing up to the drop below first voice in bass clef. The biggest quandary comes last: how to treat the running bass melody in a way that keeps the notes from smearing or confusing the listener's ear, maintaining a consistent approach from the previous descending phrases, and inevitably leading back to the opening section through the repeat, or forward to the material following rehearsal D. And we haven't even discussed the problems inherent in the accompaniment, the need for a simple, complementary color for the counter-melodies in the triplet phrase, the character and weight of the sudden chordal interjections, the consistency of the texture under those 16th note runs, and how the chords above the bass register melody progress seamlessly back to the original material at the beginning. This is the first orchestration challenge piece to feature repeats, and rather than just seeing it as a mindless repetition of material, I'm hoping my participants put a lot of thought into how to circle back in a way that feels so natural that your average listeners hardly realize it's a repeat at first. My solution of melodic instrument contrasting to the previous passage is the coolest of the cool. First clarinet in one long flowing line, accompanied by a direct transcription of the piano score's left hand onto the bassoons. But that's not enough. There needs to be a little harmonic support to clarify the meaning of the passage. So I added pianissimo descending thirds in oboes, and then a little echoing cadence in middle strings. As I mentioned before, I feel it would be too repetitious to simply run the clarinet and bassoons again. So the strings provide a graceful answer. First and second violins, a more or less direct transcription of the piano score, with better bowings in the slurs, and some harmonic cushioning from horns, violas, and cellos, the middle C pitch starting a beat earlier for best harmonic consistency. This grouping of instruments is perfect to maintain jumping into the sudden punchy chords, with the first violins very naturally leading the strings, and the horns adding a lot of push. This is probably something that Beethoven would just simplify to G octaves in the C horns, but I like the fuller sound of more comprehensively supporting the strings, and the little bite of tone on that stopped G sharp and half-stopped F sharp are nicely aggressive. For a further contrast with the clarinets, I chose a dovetailing solo for oboes. That little run of sixteenths could easily be covered by a single player, but it's better to divide it up, so that the first can just focus on the quality of tone for their upper register. This led me quite instinctively to scoring the high interjecting chord on oboes and clarinets, a great contrast to the previous horns and strings. Answering first flute, echoed an octave lower by clarinets. It all felt like something that should happen, though I'm sure I'll see many entries with different approaches that also feel very natural and inevitable. The accompaniments here are kept inconspicuous, but naturally progressive. Middle strings, then C horns and first bassoon, then back to middle strings with bassoons and horn. C basso horns work beautifully alongside bassoons, and played softly, they don't interfere all that much with the flute's projection. For that bass melody, the logical choice was first bassoon. No dovetailing with second bassoon needed in my view. These little back-and-forth runs of scales are no different from passages one might see from this time in other orchestral works, though not as exposed as I've scored them. But any decent first-chair player should handle those 2.5 bars quite well, so long as the orchestrator hasn't pushed the tempo above 120 or maybe at the maximum 126 beats per minute. I keep the interpretation legato until the very last downward run in staccato, something that feels very Beethoven to me. The precision of that concluding articulation will also make it easier for the violins to lock into the music on their entrance. And speaking of which, I score those soft right-hand chords in strings and horns, little tenuto pushes, nicely setting up the return to the opening material. Let's hear this whole section through with the mock-up now. I see it as a great opportunity to show off the wind section, while giving the string sound a little relief, and yet keeping those strings engaged enough to where it still feels orchestral, and not a wind band break, so the repeat is as seamless as I can make it. Going back to the piano score, let's start at the second ending before D. Just as the orchestrator should have concocted a seamless return on the first ending, they should also use every opportunity to set up the next treatment of the material. And I hope that my participants out there really got a lot of momentum going forward into the second half of this movement, because here's where I feel that the music is at its most potentially orchestral. This development is a conversational exchange of ideas, moods, and levels of energy, all culminating in a passionate crest of emotion before wisping away to the recapitulation at rehearsal E. There's a certain sentimental quality to the melody at bar 39, a kind of wistfulness that turns the F-sharp minor episode back towards a happier feeling with a modulation to A major. That suggests an instrument with a capacity for tenderness, but with a kind of honest simplicity. Below it, there could be an accompaniment style reminiscent of the opening, but altered to support the melody if necessary. The sudden chilly break to alternating right-hand notes really reveals that those fragments of pattern that I extracted back in bar 20 did have a life of their own. And if there was a strategy that the orchestrator used back then, it could be built on here. The little pianissimo left-hand notes might need some tenuto, as well as a careful choice of color so they don't get buried on the one hand, or sound like a foghorn on the other. The left-hand preview of the melody might well require more strength in order to kick off the forte bar that follows, while the following right-hand octave melody could probably benefit with very direct, forceful scoring. The left-hand broken chords might be transcribed directly or adapted in a different way, but they'll need a lot of energy to properly support the melody, and also to give the music enough of a sudden contrast and the immediate shift back down to piano subito. The little right-hand patterns that follow are contained enough to be easily played by a single instrument or group of instruments without any need for dovetailing or trading off. The actual question is whether the orchestrator wants to cast this entire long line over the next 10 bars with the same instrument. Is there a certain back and forth between different timbres or sections implied by the change of register in the little left-hand accompaniments? Then, as the unity of hands picks up steam from bar 51, finally giving over to a mighty descending run, is it enough to just transcribe it and be done with it? Or does that run need some additional harmonic and dynamic support in order to feel both full and sincere? The fortissimo bar and following diminuendo will require special care here, in both filling the sound picture with convincing, well-scored strength, and then casually and logically letting it subside back into the oncoming recapitulation. I took my cues for the character of my approach at rehearsal D from the bassoon solo, which was itself a logical extension of keeping the line intelligible, not to mention flowing and lyrical. So the perfect voice to spin off from the bassoon should be an instrument with the capability of capturing the plaintive quality of the statement in the tonic minor of F, and yet with a wonderful knack of leading the mood to a more wistful, nostalgic, happy place. And what better voice than the oboe in that regard? It's only 4 bars, but I feel it's as perfect as the bassoon was for the previous melodic statement. And overall, I've decided to use a very different approach, not too similar to the opening in this case. Staccato strings and 8th note measured tremolo for the harmony, with a nicely legato clarinet realizing some of the figuration from the left hand of the piano score, with second bassoon taking over the role of syncopated notes from the second horn. The only real holdover from the orchestration of the opening is in the pizzicato double bass part. That takes us to a resolution on the A-flat major chord by the 4th bar. And to match Beethoven's sudden chilly alternating Cs and E-flats, I score violins once again, a callback to the fluttering violins under the flute patterns from bar 20, which you might remember from our look at the B section. I supply soft little octaves and C basso horns on G and F sharp. The lower note of the latter will be half-stopped, but the upper note will have a nice clear pitch. Following my evaluation criteria, this part won't be a foghorn, but it'll have just enough of a footprint to lead the ear forward to these bassoon and lower string octaves. Anticipating the big octave melody, I gave them a forceful crescendo into the pickup, so that the change in energy is smooth rather than too sudden. Then, as to that octave melody, I want something simple and direct, octave violins bolstered by first flute and first clarinet, which is all the line needs, not a massive doubling for this style. The churning left-hand broken chords are turned into full back-and-forth thirds, shared by violas and cellos, with harmonic support from unison bassoons and C basso horns. Hopefully the results will sound symphonic, not just blustery. At bar 45, I mark piano subito, even though there are a lot of sudden shifts of dynamics taken for granted in Beethoven's music, and especially in this sonata, I just want to make sure that there's no involuntary diminuendo leading to the downbeat from the previous measure. I put the swirling right-hand patterns in the first violins, but then break up the regularity of the line by dovetailing little phrases between the first violins and the wind soloists. Over to first flute, then first oboe, back and forth again, and then to clarinet. Just as I'm varying the timbral quality of the ongoing line, I'm also shifting the texture of the accompaniment, middle strings doubling lower winds on that little C-sharp diminished triad at the beginning, then that nice pairing of bassoons and C basso horns. Over to clarinets, then middle strings, then bassoons plus first horn, and so on. Notice that there's a method to my madness here. Certain accompaniments recur with the same voices, like middle strings under wind solos, then horns and bassoons under first violins. The occasional appearances of the clarinets not only provide a bit of variety to avoid too much predictability, but also keep the whole passage more conversational and dynamically balanced. From the pickup to bar 52, the source piano falls into unison octave runs, with little gaps in the left hand before committing to an all-out assault through the end of bar 54. Simple enough to score. The right hand part in unison first and second violins, with doubling from flutes for a couple of bars up to the point where the line dips too far down. But the addition of first oboe to thicken the line a couple of bars before, then combining the first clarinet at the start of that bar does the work of covering the flutes dropping out. And by the end of the bar, as the line gets too low for even the oboe, unison fortissimo clarinets are quite heavy enough to carry the line in their upper chalumeau register. The left-hand part is also easy enough, if a little more crafty to score. Unison violas and cellos plus bassoons at first, then with clarinets as the line climbs a little higher, leaving out the cellos where the line climbs a bit too high, not that they couldn't double the violas here, just that it's not in Beethoven's style to do so, then adding unison bassoons as the line dives downward, with second clarinet hanging on as long as it can before jumping up to the higher line, and violas of course dropping out on that low out-of-range B. Notice the use of the marking non-legato, simply letting the players know that it's no error that slurs have been left off of the notes from that point. Meanwhile, I've maintained Beethoven's little hooking accompaniment in the horns and bassoons, culminating in this intense push on the C7th chord behind the downward rushing strings. This is something I feel that Beethoven might have done, to maintain a kind of symphonic integrity here, and not just have the passage sound like a bunch of scales. From there, the scoring is pretty straightforward, with the rising thirds covered more directly by violins and cellos, with some support and filling in of the harmony by first lower wind players and C basso horns, and second wind players, F horns, and middle strings holding down the root. Once again, first bassoon leads us gracefully forward to the recapitulation, and I've given the part a little surge of warmth on the way there, while the rest of the tutti fades gracefully back to a softer resolution. Let's hear all of the D section now, and watch for the whole dramatic arc of bittersweet nostalgia, a conversational shifting of moods and ideas, a powerful cohesion of purpose and momentum, and then a casual release into the recapitulation. Now for our analysis of the final section, which covers a lot of ground. But as a lot of this material is a reworking of previous sections, with similar inherent orchestration difficulties, there's no need for this process to be all that more involved than the previous sections of this video. Notice that I've included the pickup to bar 57 to include all the thematic material from the recapitulation. These first 6 bars are identical to the opening from the end of bar 4, so the question is whether to just repeat the same approach the orchestrator used previously, or something entirely different and original. The problem with the first option is that, with repeats, the same identical orchestration will appear 4 times over the course of the entire playback, meaning that there won't be anything new for listeners. And yet, with a completely different approach, the listener might not get the sense that they're returning home to a recognizable place in the music. So a mixed approach might work better, using familiar elements that are ennobled, expanded, in some way built upon, but still feeling like some kind of return in mood and overall color. So just as Beethoven reworks his material here from the opening of the movement, we would rework our own orchestration approach at the very least, finding a balance between what we did before, so it feels like a return, and expanding it so that the music feels ever more fulfilled and exalted. If Beethoven gives us a development of, say, the leggermente phrases, doubling their length and leading in a new harmonic direction, then we might ask how to reinterpret that, perhaps with a back and forth between different textures or sections. And with the downward swooping triplets that follow, you'd be only too welcome to enlarge the material, especially as the phrase ends with a solid fortissimo instead of a subito piano. And speaking of back and forth, Beethoven also doubles the length of the eloquent chordal statement. Is there an opportunity here to not only look back at your original approach, but also incorporate new elements based on the start of the recapitulation? I wouldn't blame anyone for feeling restricted to the strategies they incorporated from bar 16 in tackling the passage starting at bar 75, but is there at least a way of developing or progressing the energy and texture of the accompaniment, making it even more lively and vital? The problems created by wide separation of hands will still be there, but perhaps that just gives us more license to firm up the whole approach, so long as we don't lose touch of the essential elements in the source score. And there were so many ways to interpret the original bars 28 through 36 that it shouldn't be much of a problem to refresh the reboot here from 87 to 95. The elevated registers of the restatement pretty much demand a change of instrumental transcription here and there. The two biggest problems come last: how to score the vastly extended runs in the left hand, and how to bring it all to a close that's not only naturally repeatable through the first ending, but also rings with solid finality the second time through. Beethoven provides one big clue to solving both problems, however, in the way that the opening theme attempts to break out from the softly chiming chords above, not quite manifesting, but then suddenly clanging loudly in full-fingered chords in the last couple bars. Could it be that this halting change of role for the right hand opens up new possibilities of linear texture for that left-hand line, especially as it rises up into the contralto register of the orchestra? I've already touched on the way Beethoven reinterpreted his own running lines in transcription, and there are some bars here that could well need a bit of smoothing over in places. Think about all those things, and let's give Spencer Myer one last chance to eloquently make the argument. With that, it's time for a look at my last section of orchestration. This is a point in my work process where I was on a total roll, with my sense of craft just barely keeping up with the outpouring of my creative response to the original material, and I admit to going back and tinkering with the whole score a few times before I felt it was good enough to share. There are still some parts that I feel go either way. For instance, in this little harmonized statement of the opening theme by the F horns. It will probably sound perfectly fine on today's valve horns, but not so smooth and clear on the natural horns of Beethoven's time. But hopefully the unison with the first violins on that high written F, sounding B-flat, will help even out some of the rough edges of the half-stopping. I'm on firmer ground as the passage progresses, with the horns taking more of a harmonic role as the first and second violins emerge from the texture into an octave melody, with a touch of color on the top line from the first oboe. I couldn't resist hanging on to that high F divisi in both violin groups, with a little help from first flute above and F horns below. Other functions are maintained from the opening, if mutated a little, alternating Fs and Cs and bassoons and fourth horn, with an exaggerated mezzo staccato at the end, pizzicato basses laying back a little this time, and middle strings in similar support roles as before. The Leggermente passage's orchestration starts the exact same way, but I shift back to the strings for the response, and then over to the winds again, this time up an octave from the source score with flute and answering clarinet, and back to strings at the end. As with a few other sections in my orchestration, this really feels like Beethoven to me, resonating with his conversational symphonic style. Here I see Beethoven's forte to fortissimo dynamic as permission to grandly inflate the material, with violins covering the octave melodies, clarinets teaming up with violas, horns in rich central positions, and lower strings covering the bass. You'll note that I spread out the clustery left-hand chords across the sound picture, to where they intersect with the lower voice of the octave melody. I didn't feel the need to crescendo up to fortissimo, though. I simply used the expansion's natural sense of impact and added some accents. I want to keep the emphasis on a string sound here, so there's no wind doubling at all on the melody above. The alternating texture provides a somewhat severe contrast, a little reharmonized tenuto staccato in the lower winds, with a touch of pizzicato from basses below. Back and forth again, followed by another shift in the texture, blustery horns and bassoons, with some arco lower strings, answered by pizzicato strings tutti, and yet another back and forth with even snarlier horns. Here I'm not just including some stopped and half-stopped natural horn pitches by necessity, I'm counting on them to add to the cutting sound. But the pizzicato two-bar answer is a great way to bring the energy down, and to set up the next passage. With the pizzicato continuing into the next passage, the pointier sound is perfect for embellishment by 16th note tremolo harmonies on the first violins, gradually spreading across the rest of the string section. As the firsts take over their previous role of alternating on the lower notes of the piano score's right-hand patterns, arco cellos step in as the lowest note of the tremolo chords, so that the violas can double the third horn's stopped to open notes. Then, just as before, bassoons add an octave below alongside double basses. Over all of this, the flutes tweedle away in the same fashion as the section from Rehearsal B. Which leads to this passage's denouement, pretty much orchestrated in the same way as before. Except to say that the higher positions of all the notes, up a perfect fourth from the B section, bring a brighter color and a more vigorous dynamic to the proceedings. The C and F horns have sort of swapped places, as the earlier version of this passage resolved to a C chord, while this recap leads to an F. But there are some aspects of my previous approach that can't be adapted so easily, For instance, the higher positioning of the left-hand part from bar 87 makes my original transcription note for note to the bassoons a bit impractical, requiring some reshuffling of parts, which serendipitously results in a fresh approach here. First oboe on the melody, with first clarinet taking the counter melody, and first bassoon adding a little root to the phrase. But then both bassoons and middle strings coming into support just like before, with the strings echoing in the same way as well. Clarinets double the violas this time instead of F horns, to keep the dynamic and the tone quality more under control. But the horns and strings team up just as before on the emphatic chords, with even more secure open pitches in those natural horns. As oboe took the place of solo clarinet before, the first clarinetist gets payback here in taking over what was previously the first oboe solo, this time in one uninterrupted line over very simply scored middle strings. The next set of emphatic chords involve a unison with first oboe and first clarinet, and a vastly simplified and scaled down harmony, adding bassoon this time on the lowest voice. The trading off wind solos that follow are pretty much scored as before, with similar accompaniment strategies, except for the oboe adding a couple of beats and then dovetailing into the clarinet, which has a far greater capacity for diving downwards as the line does here. And that just takes us to one of our last big questions: how to interpret the much longer bass runs, which you can see that I've addressed in a trade-off between first and second bassoon. The dovetailing takes place at the very simplest possible junctions, the middle Cs on both second beats of the two consecutive bars. As the opening theme attempts to manifest, the bassoon line is gradually joined by the cellos. And where to from there? Let's find out on the next screen. Taking us to the last big question of all: how to wrap up everything convincingly, both as the transition to a repeat and as a final passage. And I hope I've risen to the challenge here in the scoring of the running line and other organizational aspects. The cellos ease into the bassoon line, taking over and carrying it forward with a few little edits to make it a bit more playable, dovetailing over to violas, which are quickly joined by first clarinet, and then over to first oboe. This thickening of the line will ensure the violas won't be overwhelmed by the other elements around this register. As the line descends, first clarinet takes over from first oboe, then is joined by bassoons and cellos as the line really starts to push forward dynamically, jumping to octaves in the last two bars. The entire effect of the sudden expansion of the line gives the texture the necessary scope in which to form a satisfying conclusion on big tutti chords. But there's more going on here, so let's restart our analysis of the page with the orchestration of the right-hand piano scoring. I transcribed the part nearly note for note onto the upper strings, but with some portato to give the notes a bit more definition, and fortunately, the scoring lifts up well away from the running line at the crescendo so as not to overwhelm that lower part. Notice, though, how I start to fill in and expand the harmony downward step by step from there, as the running line progresses and descends. Behind all this, I've doubled the strings with winds and a bit of horn trading off to bassoon at the beginning. This is all scoring to range in my choices here, but the colors work well in both their consistency and in progressing the texture from clarinets to flutes and oboes. It was awfully fun jumping the lower harmony from clarinets to oboes in bar 103. With that gradually expanding harmony, and the dynamic push of the running line into octaves, the sound picture has been stretched wide enough to where the big tutti chords won't feel so forced and sudden. Upper winds double upper strings. Notice that I don't bother putting the dominant up so high, but leave it in a lower position for second oboe and lower divisi second violins. At the other end of the orchestra, the double basses and second horn play this downward outline of the F major chord in octaves, while C horns blast out octave Cs in appropriate Beethovenian fashion, and first horn does the same with sounding Fs above middle C before ending on that third below. It's all set up so that the running line comes to an end with all the notes in a nicely balanced position, with just a bit of gap in the mid-range to underline the different direction that both main parts took, especially not interfering with the sense that the running line has settled to its final lowest note. I can also use that gap as a kind of space for the overtones of the bassoon to fill in as it picks up the line and goes into the repeat. And on the second time through, when I'm skipping that first ending, I'd like the conductor to throw in a bit of rallentando to bring the movement to a decided conclusion. Thanks so much for joining me in this guided tour through the first movement of my orchestration of Beethoven's Sonata No. 24 for the 2023 Orchestration Challenge. Don't miss my lecture on Movement 2, also released today, covering my attempt to orchestrate a piece of music that's the quintessential definition of hell on wheels. Then stay tuned to this channel for the release of our first Orchestration Challenge evaluation videos, starting tomorrow.